So yesterday on this channel, we talked about Tara Reade and her allegations and accusations against Joe Biden. I still 100% believe Tara Reade, I stand with her, and I also still feel that Joe Biden should 100% drop out of the 2020 Democratic primary. And if he won't drop out, the Democratic Party should do whatever it can to force him out, because a party that believes in women's rights, women's equality, feminism, women's dignity, all of that should not be led into a presidential election by a man who has done what Joe Biden has done. But I want to focus this video on the conduct of the mainstream media in this story, because as I noted yesterday, they've been nearly entirely silent about it. All of the coverage you've seen has come from independent media focusing in on this story. There was that excellent article by Ryan Grimm where he noted that Tara Reade in many ways tried to bring her story forward, but various organizations refused to help her, and she was smeared. Earlier on in her life in the 1990s when the incident happened, her career was basically threatened. So she never came forward until this moment, and reasonably so. And you also saw Tara Reade do excellent interviews with Katie Halper and with Cristobal and Sagar over at The Hill. Those are fantastic. There'll be links in the description once again. But beyond those sources, there was basically nothing. There were other YouTube videos by myself and other left-wing creators like the Humanist Report. But beyond that, guys, radio silence. We got our first little bit of mainstream coverage actually yesterday overnight, a little bit, I think it was last night, by Yahoo News. Yahoo News maybe isn't considered the bastion of breaking news and hard-hitting analysis, but it was in a sense the first mainstream source where sort of regular people might get their news. You don't really have to be ideologically inclined to get your news from Yahoo to actually cover this story, to cover Tara Reade and her credible and I feel damning accusations against Joe Biden. And that's important to see because a lot of people have been noting that the cracks in the dam are starting to appear. That Joe Biden has seemingly been able to not even have to deny these allegations because no mainstream source, no source that millions of people, hundreds of millions of people might see, has actually given this any oxygen. So Joe Biden hasn't even had to play defense. He hasn't had to do anything yet. But the dam is starting to show those cracks. Major YouTubers have covered it. Major sources of ideological leanings have covered it. And you're starting to see sources like Yahoo mention it too. And so my hope is that with time, you're going to see coverage from mainstream sources that will be impossible to ignore. And I have to say, though, that even if they do eventually cover it, there needs to be a lot of criticism levied at CNN and MSNBC and many other sources, because those networks have given thousands of hours of coverage to the 2020 Democratic primary, and rightfully so. It's massive news. They've covered big stories, small stories, and everything in between. And yet, when it comes to these credible allegations, which may very well be the single biggest story in this entire primary process, there's silence from MSNBC. There's silence from CNN and many of the other networks. It's inexcusable, and it's something that baffles me. The only reason they're ignoring it is because they're trying to protect Joe Biden. I can't think of any other reason. They're trying to protect Joe Biden because they worry about Bernie Sanders gaining any sort of momentum. Or if Biden is forced out, hypothetically, they could throw in a late neoliberal challenger, maybe, but there's no guarantee the voters, the public, will accept that substitution, and they might just flock to Bernie, and they're afraid of that. I noted this yesterday. And so these networks really have to ask themselves that despite their ideological opposition to Bernie Sanders, despite the fact that they clearly want a neoliberal to face off against Trump so that the rich people that own these networks, that buy the advertising time for these networks, that they win either way. I get that. I 100% understand the political economy of corporate media. I don't support it, but I get it. I'm under no illusions. But this is still such a massive story that there's no way that it should be ignored. You don't have to agree with my perspective that you believe Tara Reade 100%, or that you feel that even if you do believe her, Joe Biden should drop out. I believe that. I think any reasonable person should believe that, but you aren't compelled to believe what I believe. But we know that millions of Americans, especially boomer and older Americans, don't watch independent news. They don't get their news from sources like myself or Crystal or Sagar or Katie Halper or The Intercept. They don't. They get their news from ABC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, whatever. That's their news sources. Maybe some mainstream print outlets like the Washington Post and New York Times. All in all, they are not getting this story. And so it's very difficult to say that the public has rendered its decision because there's systematic efforts to misinform the public by omission. This is misinformation by omission because you're not lying, but you're hiding such a massive story that you may as well be lying. And I have to say that the analog to this story is the story between Christy Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. That was a similar tale of a man of great power and influence who was on the cusp of winning an incredibly important position, in that case, the Supreme Court seat. And at the 11th hour, a woman came forward with credible allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, that was Christy Ford, from his fairly distant past. But I believe those allegations, and whether you did or didn't, because people seem divided, the reality is it got extensive international weeks-long media coverage. And it was a bigger part of the confirmation hearings than the ideological positions of Brett Kavanaugh or his court history, the history of his decisions, whether or not he would be very conservative or more of a moderate conservative. Those are the things you often talk about when you're interviewing a Supreme Court justice, when you're trying to determine whether or not they should get a confirmation vote for a Supreme Court seat. This was almost exclusively about, in the mainstream media coverage, the allegations by Christy Ford. And I think rightfully so, because that's what mattered the most in that particular hearing. Joe Biden and Brett Kavanaugh are very similar men. Men who have great power, men who have great influence, men who are on the cusp of a big office, and there are credible allegations against them. And while you might question the timing, the reality of how women face barriers coming forward means that we should never really use that as an excuse, because it's always brave when a woman comes forward, and timing is something that is never perfect for a woman who is constantly threatened and smeared when she dares to do something so brave and so principled, whether it's Christy Ford or whether it's Tara Reade. And I think that if anything, the Biden situation is far worse, because the allegations against Kavanaugh go back to a time before he had any real power. I'm not trying to diminish the accusations, but the accusations against Joe Biden go back to a time when he was already a senator, one of the world's most powerful men, because he was one of the most powerful men within the American government. And he was accused of such things by one of his staffers, very credibly again. And it's not getting any coverage. And so, yes, I might sound like a bit of a broken record relative to yesterday, but I feel that as long as this story isn't getting any mainstream media coverage, I feel a special obligation to keep it on the front burner here on my channel, and I hope other progressive YouTubers will as well. Because here's the thing. I cover a lot of stories on this channel that get coverage, but get incorrect coverage. And I feel a responsibility to correct the record. But there's a special need to bring light to situations that are utterly ignored. And this is one of them. And as long as Tara Reade isn't even getting a fair hearing within the mainstream media, as Christy Blasey Ford did, they are doing a fundamental injustice to her, to all women like her, and really all survivors like her, not just women, but all people like her. And they're doing a fundamental injustice to the Democratic primary and to the entire American voting base, because they are not informing them of the actions of a man who may well be the Democratic nominee and may well be the president. That is a dereliction of duty by the media, and I will not stand for it. And that's why I'm going to keep talking about this story.